What's up everyone, I'm Eldritch, also known as the CloakingDonkey, and welcome back to my What is Total Warhammer series. In part 1 I give you all the basics of what Total War is and what Warhammer is and how they can play together. Part 2 we looked specifically at magic, mighty heroes and monsters, and in this here part 3 we are going to look specifically at the world of Warhammer. Warhammer Fantasy Battles, being almost 40 years old, has amassed a huge amount of lore over the years. Each of the major factions is steeped in rich history, so much so that I can't show it to you all, even if I tried. So instead I'm going to give a brief overview over the major factions, and then just have a quick fly over the rest of the Warhammer world. Keep in mind, however, that not all of the nations and factions have ever really been worked out all that much by Games Workshop themselves, although some third parties and fans have done a lot of writing for all of the places of the Warhammer world over the years. And there's a huge amount of, for lack of a better word, expanded universe. The Empire has always been central to most of the stories that happen in the old world. A lot of the Warhammer book series happen in the Empire, and some of the major plot stories that happened over the years also happened in the Empire or around the borders of the Empire. And there is a reason for that, because the Empire is the most prominent and powerful human nation of the old world. In fact, the Empire's influence spread so far across the old world that practically all other human nations in the old world use the Imperial calendar. And the Imperial calendar is based on when the Empire was founded 2,500 years ago by Sigmar Heldenhammer. Sigmar Heldenhammer was a powerful man who during his lifetime united the human tribes that settled in the area today known as the Empire. He forged favorable relations with the dwarves, which are still intact after over 2,000 years. And under his rule practically all tribes of greenskins were pushed south of the Grey Mountains. Sigmar was such a great and important figure to the humans that after his disappearance a cult arose that worshipped him. And this Sigmar worship never ceased to be relevant, as it is the state religion of the Empire of Man to this day. If you followed Total Warhammer in any capacity or watched any of my other previous videos, you will have heard me talk about the Emperor Karl Franz. Now this specific emperor is not the dictatorial monarch you might expect from the title. In fact, the Empire is divided in a set of provinces. Each of these provinces has a count, and these so-called elector counts form the Council of the Empire. Every couple of years the council votes for one of their members to become the emperor. So think of the emperor more as the head of state and commander-in-chief. But the emperor does not have jurisdiction over what happens in the other provinces. He just commands the Imperial army and can call the Empire to war, which would then also require the state troops to enter the war, but the counts still have the possibility to vote against him if they don't think this war is right, justified, or necessary. The Empire has always had major problems with the forces of chaos, being pretty much the first major nation between the forces of chaos and the rest of the old world. As I mentioned, the oldest allies of the Empire are the dwarves, and the Empire can mostly rely on the help of the dwarves in dire times. During various time periods of the Empire's existence, it has also been on friendly terms with the Kingdom of Bretonnia and the High Elves of Ulthuan. But they have also been at war with both of these nations, so they are not exactly on the same standing as the dwarves. The Empire also remains in friendly relations with its neighbor Kislev and the nations of Tilea and Estalia in the south. Speaking of which, let's go quickly over the other human nations in the old world. Firstly, we have the Kingdom of Bretonnia, the second largest human nation of the old world. And think of Bretonnia as a highly religious, feudal society of fantasy Frenchmen. They mainly worship the Lady of the Lake, but they also share some of the traditional deities with the Empire of Man. Due to the feudal nature of the kingdom, the army of Bretonnia predominantly consists of knights and armed peasantry, the peasantry generally acting as archers and spearmen. Bretonnia's relation to the Empire of Man is a bit of a mixed bag. There have been periods of time where the nations were in frail alliances or even called each other friends. But as is pretty much always the case in the Warhammer world, when there is less threat of the forces of chaos, there's also more squabbling between the nations. To the north of the Empire we have the Tsardom of Kislev. And Kislev really is everyone's favorite Christmas wonderland of bear-riding Russians. It's an arid and very snowy country in the north and a little bit more fertile in the south. So yeah, very much like Russia. And their proximity to the Chaos Wastes, Norska, and Troll Country means that generally those Kislevites who survive are pretty hardy people. South of Bretonnia lie the kingdoms of Estalia. As they are rather remote kingdoms in the old world, they are a bit less afraid of chaos and more afraid of the Sultanate of Araby and the Skaven, who are basically their neighbors. The Estalians are best known for being incredibly skilled seafarers, and in fact they took the first successful expedition to the lands of Lustria, where they founded the New World that I will get to later. To the east of Estalia lies Tylea, a peninsula filled with tiny independent city-state kingdoms. The merchant princes in command of the city-states are some of the richest people in the old world, and these cities reflect it, to the point where Tylea is one of the only nations in the old world that does not have a standing army but runs entirely on a mercenary army. Each of the merchant princes has their own army, and in times of threat to all of Tylea they come together in large mercenary armies to defeat whatever Gribblies try to invade them, usually orcs or Skaven. And now that we're done with the humans of the old world, let's take a look at the dwarves. The dwarves are an ancient race of stout shorties, and while they're not as ancient as the elves, they've had enough time to collect plenty of grudges. And I'm not even joking. The entire dwarf society revolves heavily around personal honor. A dwarf's honor is what defines them as a dwarf, and as such, if they feel wronged by someone, they will hold that grudge literally until they die or it has been repaid. In general, it's a good idea not to piss off a dwarf, because you're probably gonna have to deal with his entire clan. The dwarves of the Warhammer world live in strongholds throughout the mountains of the old world, from the Grey Mountains in the west and all along the World's Edge Mountains to the east. Each of these strongholds houses several clans. Dwarf clans are not just families, they are multiple families combined into one clan through intermarriage, and they generally are small sub-societies within the stronghold society that they belong to. Each dwarven stronghold has a king, and these kings do rule over their stronghold independently, but they do swear allegiance to the High King. The High King is technically elected by the kings, but generally the High King is the oldest, wealthiest, most powerful, and most honorful dwarf there is. If a dwarf wants to become king, there really is only one way of doing it: being really good at being a dwarf. The dwarves have some of the most highly skilled engineers and craftsmen. They don't, however, dabble in magic like the other factions do, and instead their magic has a dwarven way to it. They have basically refined magic into a craft, and that would be the craft of runesmithing. Runesmiths are basically wizards, except that they channel magic through powerful symbols. The dwarves have some of the most advanced military hardware of the old world, with rifles and organ cannons, flame cannons and flamethrowers, as well as flying machines. And at the same time, the dwarves need this because they're not particularly good at riding, and an army that doesn't have any cavalry kind of has to make up for that with guns. Between the Empire of Man and the Dwarf Holds lies Sylvania, home to the spooky vampire counts. Technically, Sylvania is actually part of the Empire. It is a region within Stilland, one of the Empire's provinces. But really, it's the domain of the vampire clans. It's a dark, dreary, and incredibly spooky place, and the few humans who actually still live there know exactly what's going on and nail their doors shut at night. This had been going on for quite a while, but it first became really obvious that Sylvania was no longer part of the Empire when Vlad von Karstein, one of the most powerful vampires who ever lived, raised an undead army and marched on the imperial capital of Altdorf. And nowadays that the Counts of Stilland know what goes on in the region of Sylvania, they just simply try to stay out of it as much as they can and just ignore it if possible. There are 4 dominant clans of vampires in Sylvania: the feral and bat-like Strigoi, the necromancy-obsessed Necrarch, the seductive and beautiful Lamia, and the very classically Transylvanian von Karsteins. Sylvania has become a refuge for all sorts of lawless folks, because they know that the Counts of Stilland don't really want to go to that place at all if possible. And so not only vampires and necromancers find themselves here, but also bandits and all sorts of other criminals. It's a real jolly place. And now we come to the final basic race of Total Warhammer, the Greenskins. They are called the Greenskins because they are both orcs and goblins. These races just kind of tend to work together because orcs are, in general, a little bit stupid, and goblins, while clever and mischievous, are just tiny and get crushed by pretty much every other race living in the old world. And so they have this symbiotic relationship going on. The greenskins of the old world are all over the Badlands, and they've taken a vast chunk of the world's edge mountains for themselves as well. They can, however, also be found in pretty much every other region of the old world, as they regularly pop up in any region that civilization doesn't reach. Forest goblins and savage orcs inhabit pretty much every larger forest area, even those within the Empire. Greenskin society is tribal. There are hundreds of tribes of orcs and goblins in the old world. The tribes fight each other constantly because war is all the greenskins know. The greenskins don't expand their territories for power or wealth, they expand it purely to find new and interesting people that they can then kill. Sometimes a boss will call out a warg, and several tribes might come together and follow this boss, and they will then proceed to ravage across the lands and lay waste to anything they come across. And some of the biggest wargs that ever happened threatened to bring the old world to its knees. But even outside of these giant congregations of tribes, the greenskins are always a threat to the other races. In fact, besides the forces of chaos, they are the greatest challenge of both humans and dwarves. Now, as we all know, there is a fifth race in Total Warhammer that is a pre-order bonus, and that is the Forces of Chaos, the primary bad guys in the Warhammer world. Chaos does not play nice with anyone, they just want to corrupt, conquer, and destroy. Way up in the north even of Kislev, lies the peninsula of Norska. And Norska was once a cold but happy place, inhabited by sort of Conan-looking Viking people. But then the forces of chaos ravaged all over Norska, and now, well, they're still Conan-looking Viking people, it's just that now they're evil Conan-looking Viking people. And because the Chaos Hordes don't play nice with anyone, they are the biggest threat in the Warhammer world to pretty much everybody. The primary forces behind all this malice are the four gods of chaos. Khorne, the blood god, who is all about slaughtering the innocent and turning them into fashionable furniture on which he can then rest his weary body. Nurgle is the god of plagues and sickness. And some of the older publications of Warhammer also said that Nurgle was probably actually a nice god. He was such a nice god that he just wants to hug people. It's just when he does, the huggy gets Ebola, swine flu, and the Black Plague. Tzeentch is probably the most perfidious of the gods, as he is the god of change. What that really means is up to interpretation, as it is supposed to be. And lastly, we have Slaanesh. And Slaanesh is basically the god of hedonism. Slaanesh corrupts through indulgence. Too much food, too much wine, too much smoking, and too much perversion. And because this is absolutely not politically correct, Slaanesh has recently been deleted by Games Workshop, because when your main audience is 8 to 12-year-olds, society doesn't really like it too much when you push hedonism on them. Beyond these nations, however, there is so much more to the Warhammer world. For example, nestled into the forest of Lorien, southeast of Bretonnia, are the Wood Elves. Mystical and ancient, they are basically the elves that were left behind when the other elves moved away from the old world, thousands of years ago. Between Astalia and Tylea is where the Skavens find their home, mainly around their corrupted city of Skavenblight. Now the Skaven exist in other places of the old world, they can pretty much be found anywhere where there's poop or a bunch of garbage because they're vermin. But they are mainly settled in between these two human nations. The Skaven are a strange race of mutated rat people, and to the civilized races of the Warhammer world, not that much is known about where they actually come from. With their origin shrouded in mystery, they're still a very significant threat to a lot of different people. For the dwarves especially, when it's not the greenskins, it's generally the Skaven. Because as the dwarves are sitting in their strongholds underground, the Skaven are really fond of underground places as well. And I would personally say expect the Skaven to make their appearance in one of the other two games of the Total Warhammer trilogy. Off the shores of the old world, we have the mysterious island nation of Albion, inhabited mostly by druids and giants. South of the old world, we have the large desert of Nehekara, which thousands of years ago was a vibrant civilization, but now it's just a bunch of skeletons, led by the Tomb Kings who simply just don't want to let go of this mortal realm. Inhabiting the coastal regions of the southern continent is the Sultanate of Arabi. And Araby is basically your one-stop shop for spices, gold and slaves. Across the sea we have the subcontinent of Lostria, and it is home to the lizardmen. There are a couple of other races there, but the lizardmen really are the predominant civilization, if you want to call them that, and they are one of the big players in the Warhammer world. So once again, look for them in one of the other 2 games in the trilogy. To the north of Lustria we have the New World that was settled by the mighty seafarers of Estalia, and in the middle of the ocean we have the large island nation of Ulthuan, home to the High Elves. It used to be home to all the elves that left the old world, but then there was a big civil war because some of them liked to be really high and mighty and others really liked to poke needles into others and practice blood magic. The goody two-shoe elves eventually won and sent their cousins packing, who basically then became pirate elves and formed the nation of Nagaroth. To the east of the old world we have the vast steppes inhabited by the Hobgoblin Khan, a nomadic race of hobgoblins who loves to ride wolves and kill pretty much anyone who tries to go from the old world to the vast mysterious kingdoms in the east. Between the old world and the hobgoblin steppes lie the World's Edge Mountains, and to the east of the steppes lie the vast ogre kingdoms. The ogres are an incredibly brutal race who are also one of the major players in the Warhammer world. And to the east of them lies the giant Grand Empire of the Celestial Dragon, the nation of Katai. And this is not some backwater tribe. The Grand Empire of the Celestial Dragon is in fact very advanced. They built an incredibly long wall to keep the chaos out of their beautiful empire. South of Katai lie the hinterlands of Kuresh, which are mostly covered in jungle and are just filled to the brim with magically inclined people. It's like the sorcerers grow on trees there. To the west of it we have the Kingdom of Ind, and it is probably the nation that has the least stuff written about it in the entire Warhammer world. On all the maps that I find about the Warhammer world, it's generally just marked with an elephant head. And lastly we have the island nation of Nippon. By now you've probably realized what this map resembles, and so yeah, Nippon is basically a fantasy version of Japan. So as you can see, there is a lot to the Warhammer world, and despite this being one of the longest videos in this series, I only just scratched the surface because there is so much lore to this world. If any of this piqued your curiosity, there are tons of books that you can read about this world that are really good, by the way, and there's lots of other source material to be found on the internet. Next time in this series, we are going to look at the more Total War side of things, for you folks who come from Warhammer and maybe haven't played Total War all that much. And I'm really gonna try this time to make the gap in between these 2 videos a little bit smaller. But until then, I've been the CloakingDonkey, and I'll see you in another video!